As far as anyone can tell, life has existed on this planet for roughly 4 billion years, a number so large it's genuinely hard to hold in your head, covering nearly 9/10 of the entire history of the universe itself. But there's a genuinely strange possibility worth taking seriously. It might have actually started right after the Big Bang, back when the universe was a far stranger and more extreme place than the one we live in now. A universe that may have briefly allowed life to take root almost anywhere within it. If that's true, the cosmos could be scattered with the dormant seeds of life, sleeping quietly in dead, frozen corners of space, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. Tiny organisms, and maybe not so tiny ones, could be far more common than we assume, hidden not because they're rare, but because they're simply waiting. What follows is two highly speculative but scientifically grounded ideas, woven together into one larger possibility, the kind of idea that sits right at the edge of what current evidence can actually support, but is built entirely out of real physics and real biology, rather than pure imagination. To get there, it helps to start with a genuine puzzle about life right here on Earth. For its first several 100 million years, this planet was a molten hellscape, under constant asteroid bombardment. But almost the instant things settled down and the first oceans formed, life showed up. And not just a little of it. Microbes rapidly filled essentially every available niche. That timing is strange. Life on Earth looks almost exactly as old as the planet itself, as though it had been waiting the whole time for its first real opportunity. And it's not just that life appeared fast. In that same narrow window, it also crossed an enormous gap in complexity. To count as genuinely alive, even the simplest microbe needs to eat, expel waste, grow, and reproduce, and doing all of that requires a genome, the biological instruction manual that governs how an organism actually works. Exactly how lifeless chemistry became something with a working genome is one of the deepest open questions in science, and simplified to its core, the problem is almost circular. Building a functioning genome requires proteins, and building those proteins requires a functioning genome already in place. Both genomes and proteins are long, intricate molecules built from complex parts that are extraordinarily unlikely to assemble correctly by pure chance. A chicken and egg problem, with several chickens and several eggs tangled together. One popular attempt to untangle that knot is called the RNA world hypothesis. The idea that an earlier, simpler molecule called RNA might have acted as both the instruction manual and the tool that carried out those instructions before DNA and proteins split that job into two separate specialists the way life does today. It's an elegant idea, and there's real laboratory evidence that RNA can, under the right conditions, copy itself and even catalyze simple chemical reactions on its own. But getting from a single self-copying RNA molecule floating in some primordial puddle to something as intricate as a functioning cell is still an enormous, largely unexplained leap. And nobody has recreated that transition from scratch in a lab. Once a working cell exists, the whole system runs smoothly. But getting from simple, lifeless chemistry to that level of sophistication through blind trial and error should plausibly take an enormous amount of time. So how did the first living things manage to close that gap in only a few 100 million years? Most theories about the origin of life try to explain it by imagining some primordial soup of prebiotic molecules that eventually, efficiently, produced the first self-replicating structures. But nobody has actually demonstrated how that would work in practice, in full, from beginning to end. Maybe it's worth trying to think about the problem backwards instead. Picture a genome as something like a long book, recording the entire history of life. As time passed and evolution kept adding new chapters, the cast of characters grew. Amoebas, fish, amphibians, dinosaurs, mammals. Over billions of years, the story just kept getting more complicated. A genome, in this framing, is really a long string of biological instructions, and from the simplest microbes up to us today, the functional size of that instruction set appears to have grown at a surprisingly steady rate. A fish's functional genome is roughly twice the size of a worm's. Ours is roughly twice the size of a fish's. Bacteria sit at the very bottom of that ladder, with genomes measured in a few million base pairs. Plants and amphibians occupy the middle rungs, and some of the most complex organisms alive today, including certain flowering plants, have genomes many times larger than our own. which on its own is a good reminder that genome size and how complicated an organism seems don't always line up perfectly. It's a real simplification. Biology is messier than any clean rule, but the pattern is strong enough to be worth taking seriously. Genomes appear to double in functional size, on average, roughly every 350 million years, almost as if evolution has been running on a steady, exponential internal clock. Here's where it gets genuinely odd. The very earliest microbes that appeared on Earth, even though they look simple on the surface, already seem to have had surprisingly long, complex genomes for how little time had passed. So how did life reach that level of sophistication so quickly? It's worth pausing here to be honest about how shaky this particular idea is. Genome size doesn't track neatly with complexity across the board. There are humble-looking amoebas with genomes many times larger than a human's, largely padded out with repetitive, non-functional sequences that don't actually do much of anything, and evolutionary biologists have pointed out that functional genome size is itself a slippery thing to measure consistently across wildly different kinds of organisms. The doubling time figure is really an average trend pulled from a limited, uneven sample, not a precise physical law like the decay rate of a radioactive isotope. So treating it as a literal clock, accurate enough to extrapolate 10 billion years into the past, is a genuinely bold leap, interesting enough to take seriously as a hypothesis, but nowhere near solid enough to call it settled. There's one intriguing way to try to resolve that. Take the exponential doubling clock at face value and run it backward, all the way to the simplest conceivable starting point, something like an organism with a genome only a few letters long. Do that, and the math lands somewhere around 10 billion years in the past, more than twice the actual age of the Earth. Which means, if that clock is roughly right, life as we know it didn't actually begin here. It began somewhere else, out in space, long before this planet even existed. That would neatly explain why life got going so fast once Earth cooled enough to have oceans. If it was already out there, dormant like a seed, all it needed was liquid water and warm enough temperatures to wake back up and keep evolving. It would also explain why the earliest life on Earth already looks unexpectedly sophisticated, because it might not have actually started from scratch here at all. It could have already been evolving for billions of years somewhere else in the universe first. This general idea that life, or at least the raw ingredients for it, could travel between worlds, isn't new. It's called Panspermia, and versions of it have been floated seriously since the early 20th century. Some proposals go even further, suggesting the spreading could have been deliberate rather than accidental, an idea sometimes called directed panspermia, floated half seriously by a couple of well-known scientists decades ago as a thought experiment about whether an earlier civilization might have intentionally seeded other worlds. Most researchers today treat that specific version as far-fetched, but the more modest version, that hardy microbial life, or at least complex prebiotic chemistry, could survive a journey through space on a rock or comet and take root somewhere new, is taken seriously enough to be an active area of study, partly because we already know some organisms on Earth today, like tardigrades, can survive being frozen, dried out, and blasted with radiation levels that would be instantly fatal to almost anything else, which at least demonstrates that biology doesn't have to be nearly as fragile as it looks. Could life genuinely be that old? Maybe. In fact, it may have started only shortly after the universe itself came into existence. At its most basic, life needs two things: the right chemical elements to build complex molecules, and a liquid medium, usually assumed to be water, where those molecules can move around and interact with each other, and that liquid has to stay warm enough to actually remain liquid. That's why the search for life beyond Earth usually focuses on Earth-like planets sitting at just the right distance from their star. But there may have been a much stranger period, very early on, when nearly the entire universe briefly met that condition at once. Right after the Big Bang, the universe was extraordinarily hot. As it expanded, it cooled, and somewhere between roughly 10 and 17 million years after the beginning, when the universe was something like 1,000 times younger than it is now, its background temperature happened to pass directly through the range where water stays liquid, somewhere between 100 and 0 degrees Celsius. This background temperature is the same cosmic microwave background radiation astronomers still detect today as a faint afterglow filling every direction of the sky, just cooled now to barely 3 degrees above absolute zero. But run the clock backward, and that same glow was once warm enough to boil water, then briefly, perfectly, just warm enough to leave it liquid. For that narrow window, more than 13.7 billion years ago, essentially every single point in the universe sat at a temperature capable of supporting liquid water, regardless of whether it was anywhere near a star, a planet, or anything resembling a solid surface at all. An extraordinary, almost paradoxical idea, since surviving in the freezing vacuum of space is usually thought of as one of the most basic requirements ruling out life almost everywhere we look today. Temperature alone isn't enough, of course. Life also needs heavier elements like carbon and oxygen, and those are normally forged inside stars. So the obvious question is whether stars even existed that early. Possibly, yes, in the unusually dense pockets of the very early universe. Astronomers call this hypothetical first generation of stars population 3 stars. Stars that, unlike every star born since, would have formed purely out of hydrogen and helium left over from the Big Bang itself, with none of the heavier elements that later generations of stars, including our own sun, inherited from their predecessors. Without those heavier elements to help gas clouds cool and fragment efficiently, models suggest these first stars would have been dramatically larger than typical stars today, and enormous stars burn through their fuel fast. Some could have lived and died in a supernova in as little as 3 million years, seeding the surrounding young universe with exactly the heavier elements needed to eventually build dust, asteroids, planets, and the raw ingredients of life. None of these first-generation stars has ever actually been directly observed. They remain a theoretical prediction, though a well-motivated one, and finding indirect evidence of them is an active goal for next-generation telescopes. It's even possible that the earliest ancestors of life didn't need liquid water at all. Exotic solvents, like ammonia or ethane, stay liquid at temperatures far below freezing, meaning early life built around chemistry like that could have kept going for tens of millions of years longer, sustained by the lingering afterglow of the Big Bang itself, long enough to overlap with the point where we know for certain that stars and all the necessary elements already existed. Chemists who study this kind of weird life point out that ammonia, in particular, can dissolve many of the same kinds of organic molecules water can, and stays liquid down to roughly minus 77 degrees Celsius under the right pressure, which would have massively widened the window and the range of places where chemistry like this could have kept ticking along. Suppose some of that early exotic chemistry really did get far enough to become genuinely alive, and even far enough somewhere to develop into a technological civilization, 10 or more billion years before humans existed. What would something like that even look like today? It's almost impossible to guess with any confidence, but it raises interesting questions for how we search for advanced life at all. Not just biosignatures like unusual atmospheric gases, but technosignatures, signs of large-scale engineering, unusual waste heat, or structures that don't look like anything nature builds on its own. So far, none of our searches for either kind of signal have turned up anything, which on its own doesn't rule the idea out. It might just mean that even a 10 billion year head start isn't necessarily enough to produce something we'd easily recognize, or that whatever came from that early era is simply too far away, too old, or too different from us to notice at all. The genuinely striking part of this idea is the contrast. The universe today is overwhelmingly hostile to life almost everywhere you look. But for that brief early window, the conditions for life may have existed practically everywhere at once. For a stretch that might have lasted several tens of millions of years, primitive life could conceivably have emerged on nearly any rock or even out in the cold spaces between early stars, quietly sowing the universe with the raw seeds of what would, billions of years later, become bacteria, trilobites, dinosaurs, and eventually us. Eventually, the universe cooled below the threshold needed to sustain that kind of life. But some of those earliest organisms might not have simply vanished. They could have persisted in the residual internal warmth of the first planets, or gone dormant, frozen inside asteroids, or drifting cosmic dust. Tiny seeds scattered across the cosmos, waiting for a new hospitable environment to wake up in and keep evolving. If that actually happened, life today might be far more widespread throughout the universe than we currently have any way of confirming. It's a compelling story, and both the idea of a briefly habitable early universe and the idea of an exponential clock hidden in genome size, are reasonable, evidence-adjacent hypotheses, but they remain genuinely speculative, one possible explanation among several competing for our existence. Still, if life really did seed itself across the solar system from somewhere out in space, it should have left traces elsewhere too. Maybe there are fossils buried in what used to be riverbeds on Mars. And this isn't purely hypothetical. Rovers have already identified ancient river deltas and lakebeds on the Martian surface, and part of their mission is specifically to collect samples that a future mission could bring back for detailed lab analysis, looking for exactly this kind of evidence. Maybe life is quietly surviving right now in the warm underground oceans, hidden beneath the ice of Enceladus or Europa. Both moons have already been observed venting plumes of water vapor out into space, which future missions could sample directly without even needing to land or drill. Titan has entire seas, rivers, and lakes of liquid ethane and methane, sitting at roughly the same temperature the universe itself was when it was about 90 million years old, meaning that if something genuinely alien turned up in one of Titan's lakes, it would lend real support to the idea that life could plausibly have originated in that strange, brief, early universe window in the first place. In each of these cases, the general strategy is the same. Look for biosignatures, meaning chemical patterns like unusual ratios of certain gases or molecules that are far more stable in a living system than they'd be if produced by ordinary geology alone, that are difficult to explain except by biology. So far, when we look out at the universe, we don't see any obvious sign of anyone else out there, a puzzle serious enough that it has a name: the Fermi paradox. If the universe is old enough and big enough for intelligent life to be common, where is everybody? But maybe that's simply because building anything like a technological civilization takes 10 billion years or more of accumulated evolutionary complexity to reach, meaning most life in the universe, if it exists at all, might still be nowhere close to that point. Under that framing, the universe wouldn't be empty so much as extremely young in evolutionary terms, almost everywhere at once. There could be millions of worlds quietly filled with nothing more than microbes, oceans teeming with strange alien fish, continents crawling with bizarre, unfamiliar animals, and maybe, here and there, other minds that only just recently became conscious enough to look up at their own sky and wonder, for the first time, whether they're alone. If that's roughly right, we wouldn't be early observers looking out at a young, still-forming universe. We'd just be one of the first threads in a much larger tapestry that's only now starting to become visible to itself, world by world, on staggered and unsynchronized timelines. Life could be flourishing right now, in countless forms, scattered across every kind of environment the universe has to offer. And if a meaningful share of it genuinely does trace back to one shared cosmic origin, the same early, hot, briefly habitable universe, the same scattering of ancient seeds drifting between the stars, then in some very real sense, all of it, every microbe, every fish, every creature capable of asking the question in the first place, including us, would belong to one enormous, scattered cosmic family, distant cousins separated not by an ocean or a continent, but by billions of years and unfathomable stretches of empty space. The answer might be sitting closer than we think, somewhere in our own cosmic backyard. It's worth going and finding out.